She didn't remember the exact moment the trail vanished, only the sickening realization that she'd stepped off it, following what she thought was a shortcut. Snow had been falling for hours already, soft at first, then heavier, turning the landscape into a shifting white ocean. By late afternoon, the wind was carving ridges through the drifts, and the sky had that flat gray warning that meant more was coming. Maya stopped, pulling her scarf higher over her mouth. She listened for the distant hum of the highway she'd left that morning, but the wind swallowed everything. Her footprints behind her were already half filled. She checked her phone again, 1% battery, no signal. Pressing the power off felt like closing a door on the last bit of comfort she had. She tried to retrace her steps, but the path was gone. Every direction looked identical, white slopes, dark trees, the faint outline of a ridge in the distance. The storm thickened, limiting visibility to a few dozen feet. Panic rose, hot and fast, tightening her throat. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She'd trained for backcountry hiking. She knew the basics. Don't move blindly. Conserve energy. Find shelter before night. When she spotted the fallen spruce wedged between two boulders, it felt like a small miracle. Snow had piled around it, but left a crawl space just large enough for a temporary refuge. She dropped to her knees, hands stinging in the cold even inside her gloves, and dug out the space enough to slide inside. The branch tips poked her jacket, but it blocked the worst of the wind. She curled up, hugging her pack. Her water bottle had started to freeze. She kept it inside her coat to thaw with her body heat. She broke a granola bar into small bites, forcing herself to ration it. The temperature plummeted fast. She could feel the cold seeping through the fabric, settling deep into her bones. Her thighs and feet ached with a dull, numbing throb. Hours passed. Snow whispered against the branches above her, a steady, suffocating sound. She tried to sleep in small bursts, but each time she drifted off, a shiver snapped her awake. She rubbed her calves, curled her toes, anything to fight off the creeping numbness. Night came fully, but she couldn't see it, only sensed it in the deeper cold and the way the forest seemed to grow still. At one point she murmured to herself just to hear another voice. "You're okay, you're sheltered, you waited out." But doubt gnawed at her. The storm wasn't easing. She needed a real shelter, something sturdier, something she could survive in for more than a night. This small hollow was only a pause, not a solution. By dawn, what little dawn there was under the storm, she knew she had to move. Her legs were stiff, her fingertips burning with early frostnip. She crawled out from under the fallen tree and stood in knee-deep snow. The wind had died, but the world was silent and unfamiliar. Her tracks from yesterday were gone. Maya scanned the horizon. The ridge she'd glimpsed the previous day still loomed to the west. If she could reach higher ground, she might reorient herself, or find a better shelter. She tightened her pack straps, took a long breath that steamed in the air, and started walking. Every step was heavy, each one a reminder that she had no certainty, no trail, no guarantee she'd make it out. But she kept moving, listening to her breath, feeling the snow shift under her boots, whispering to herself with each step. Just go a little farther, just reach the ridge. By mid-morning, pain flared in her right ankle, sharp, biting, and she stumbled, catching herself on her hands. When she tried to put weight on it, it trembled. Not broken, but twisted badly. The injury sent a cold surge of dread through her. She looked up toward the ridge, still impossibly far. That was when she saw the faint outline of something dark near a cluster of pines. Not a rock, not a tree. Something angular. She narrowed her eyes through the drifting snow. A structure. Her heart kicked hard. She limped toward it, breath shaking. It wasn't until she was within 30 feet that she realized it was an old, weather-beaten hunting cabin, half buried in snow, a real shelter, a chance. She pushed through the drifts toward it, unaware that the next 19 days would test her in ways she'd never imagined, and that finding the cabin was only the beginning. The cabin door resisted her at first, frozen into its frame by layers of ice. She braced her shoulder against it, shoved hard, and felt it crack free with a dry, splintering sound. A gust of stale, cold air rushed out. Inside, the space was dim, dust heavy in the beams of weak daylight slipping through warped boards. But it was shelter, 4 walls, a roof. and just enough space to feel like something she could survive in. She closed the door behind her, but it didn't seal fully. The frame was warped, leaving thin gaps where the wind moaned through. Still, it was better than the open forest. She pulled off her gloves, flexing numb fingers, and took slow steps around the cabin. There was a rusted cot frame in one corner, its mesh sagging but intact. A small wood stove sat near the center, its pipe angling through a patchwork hole in the roof. Cold ashes lay inside it, proof that someone had once relied on it. Her ankle throbbed with every movement. She lowered herself onto the cot frame and closed her eyes for a moment, letting her breath steady. She knew she couldn't stay immobile for long. She needed heat. Fire meant life. She rummaged through the cabin. Under a collapsed shelf, she found a tin can half full of nails, a broken lantern, crumpled paper, and, miraculously, a small metal box containing matches. Her hands shook as she opened it. Most were damp and swollen. Useless, but 7 or 8 were still dry. Even one might save her. She allowed herself one moment to breathe out a shaky, relieved laugh. Then she went back to work. She scavenged fallen twigs and desiccated bark from a rotted beam near the door. In the corner beneath the cot, she found a wad of old cloth, brittle with age, but still flammable. She arranged everything carefully inside the stove, the cloth first, then the small twigs, then the bark. She struck the first match. Nothing but a weak scrape. The second sputtered but died in a small curl of smoke. On the third try, the flame caught, small and trembling. When it touched the cloth, it bloomed into a flickering orange glow. Maya fed the flame slowly, whispering, "Come on, come on." The stove crackled, smoke snaking up the chimney pipe. Within minutes, warmth began pushing back the chill. She held her hands near the stove, feeling the aching sting of thawing skin. Her feet tingled painfully. She unwrapped the scarf from around her neck, draped it over the stove to dry, and allowed herself a tiny sip of water. It tasted metallic from the bottle, half frozen but precious. Hours passed as she coaxed the fire and rested her ankle. The storm outside eased into a gentle hush. By late afternoon, the world seemed muted, the cabin settling into a rhythm of slow creaks and soft heat. When she stepped outside briefly to gather more wood, the cold hit her like a slap. Every breath burned. She moved carefully, searching beneath the pines for fallen branches. She found a few, snapped them into manageable pieces, and carried them back in an awkward, limping shuffle. The effort sent spikes of pain up her leg, but she forced herself to keep going, reminding herself that without fuel, the fire, and her chances would die. Inside again, she stacked the wood neatly near the stove. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had only 2 granola bars left and a handful of trail mix, nowhere near enough for days, let alone weeks. She forced herself to eat only a few nuts, a single piece of dried fruit. As daylight faded, she listened to the distant groan of shifting ice on the trees. A quiet dread settled in. She knew no one would start looking for her until she missed her check-in 2 days from now, and even then, storms could delay search efforts for days. She lay on the cot frame, wrapped in her jacket, the fire's glow dancing on the walls. Exhaustion tugged at her, but her mind kept racing. Water, food, firewood, shelter integrity, every survival need loomed over her. Sometime after midnight, a sharp cracking sound echoed outside, like something heavy snapping under strain. Maya jolted upright, heart pounding. She reached for her flashlight, clicked it on, and swept the dim beam across the cabin walls. Nothing moved. She crept to the window, wiped a small circle in the frost, and peered out. The forest was still, but then she heard it again, closer this time. A deep groaning shift followed by a dull thud. Snowpack settling? A tree falling? Or something else? Her breath fogged the window. She waited, listening. That was when she realized the sound wasn't from the forest. It was from the roof, a slow, ominous, sagging creak. Snow, too much of it, had piled up during the storm. And now, in the quiet of night, the cabin roof was beginning to give under the weight. If it collapsed, she'd be buried alive. She backed away from the window, pulse hammering, staring up at the buckling ceiling as the wood trembled again. Maya stared at the ceiling, breath shallow, watching the wood bow ever so slightly under the weight of the snow. Another shuddering groan rolled through the cabin, long, deep, like the timbers themselves were crying out. She grabbed her pack, slung it over her shoulder, and limped toward the door. The fire was still burning, but she didn't dare stay inside if the roof was about to collapse. The moment she opened the door, the cold slammed into her again. Night air knifed across her exposed skin. She blinked into the faint moonlight, the entire world washed in shades of silver and blue. The storm had cleared, revealing a sky filled with sharp stars. But beauty meant nothing if she froze out here. She stepped into the snow, moving as fast as her injured ankle allowed. Every footstep sank nearly to her knees. She glanced back, just in time to see the cabin shudder again. A plume of powder puffed out from the roof's edge. She winced. She needed distance. If the structure gave way, the snow slide could bury half the clearing. She reached the line of pines and pressed her back against a tree, panting, watching. Minutes dragged. Her breaths formed short, uneven clouds. The cold gnawed at her despite the layers she wore. She shifted her weight, trying to ease the throbbing in her ankle. Then, crack. The sound was sharp, final. The roof caved in with a muffled crash, snow pouring in like a breaking wave. A tremor rippled through the ground beneath her boots. A few birds, startled from their perches, burst upward in a flurry of wings before disappearing into the dark. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing a wave of despair. Losing the cabin meant losing shelter, the stove, the meager warmth she'd built. She forced herself to inhale slowly, pulling her thoughts back into focus. "You're still alive," she whispered. "Keep moving." She couldn't stay exposed. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could already feel her fingertips stiffening. She needed another plan. She scanned the tree line. A few yards away, thick drifts had piled up around a cluster of fallen branches and half-buried logs. Snow caves, improvised ones, could hold warmth surprisingly well. If she could dig into that pile, carve out a hollow, it might keep her alive until morning. She shuffled over and kicked at the drift. The top layer was crusted hard, but underneath, the snow was powdery. She pulled a small plastic trowel from her pack, originally meant for digging bathroom holes on the trail. Now it might save her life. She dug slowly, methodically, her breath coming in tense bursts. Snow piled behind her, her gloves grew damp, her shoulders burned with effort. 15 minutes in, the cold had started to seep into her wrists and ankles, making her movements clumsy. But she kept digging. She widened the hollow, creating a small entrance she could crawl through and a dome-like interior just big enough to curl up in. She lined the floor with broken fir branches she gathered in short, hurried forays, careful not to overexert herself. The makeshift bed lifted her body just enough to avoid lying directly on the freezing ground. She crawled inside, pushed her pack into the entrance as a partial plug, and curled tightly into herself. The darkness inside was near absolute. But it was warmer, barely, but enough to stop the worst of the shaking. Her breaths created a thin layer of frost on the walls. She pulled her jacket tighter, tucking her hands against her chest. For hours, she fought drifting in and out of shallow sleep. Every time she woke, she had to rub her fingers and toes to keep circulation going. At one point, she realized she hadn't eaten since the handful of nuts earlier in the day. She forced herself to chew 3 more pieces of trail mix, but her stomach still cramped with hollow hunger. Her mind kept replaying the sound of the cabin collapsing, the one place that could have gotten her through. Multiple days, gone in an instant. The fear of what tomorrow held pressed down on her like the weight of the snow above her head. But dawn finally came. A soft gray glow seeped through the thin wall of snow near the entrance. Maya pushed her pack aside, crawled out, and winced as the cold slapped her awake. The world was brutally silent. Her ankle ached sharply when she put weight on it, threatening to buckle. She limped back to the collapsed cabin. Smoke still puffed weakly from the broken stovepipe, which now stuck out at a crooked angle like a fractured bone. Snow had poured inside, burying everything. She dug briefly at the edge, hoping to salvage a scrap of cloth or something she could burn, but the drift was too deep, too heavy, too risky. She stopped and looked at the tree line. If she wanted to live, she needed a new shelter, something more stable than a snow cave. She needed a reliable water source. She needed to conserve the last half of her remaining granola bar. And above everything else, she needed to try to move closer to where rescuers might search. Through the trees, she spotted a long, narrow valley stretching out between two ridges. A drainage area. Valleys often led to streams. Streams could lead to trails, or at least lower ground, where she might signal search teams. She tightened her pack, grit her teeth against the pain in her ankle, and began the slow descent toward the valley. She didn't realize it yet, but only a few miles ahead lay something that would change the next stretch of her ordeal completely. A discovery in the snow that would give her a fragile, flickering sense of hope. The descent into the valley was slow and grueling. Every step sent a sharp pulse through her ankle, radiating upward into her calf. The snow softened as she moved lower, which helped her footing but soaked her boots, chilling her toes until they burned. She paused often, too often, leaning on trees, catching her breath, reminding herself not to panic as exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. By late morning, the sky had brightened, though thin clouds were gathering again on the horizon. She recognized the look of them, another storm coming, maybe by nightfall. She needed shelter before then, or she wouldn't make it through another frozen night. As she moved deeper into the valley, she noticed the terrain shifting. The ground sloped gently, and the snow thinned near occasional outcroppings of exposed rock. Then she saw something ahead, something that made her blink and squint to be sure her mind wasn't imagining it. Tracks. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Old, softened around the edges, partially filled with frost, but unmistakably human. Someone had passed through this valley weeks ago, maybe months, but it meant a hunting route or a seasonal ranger path couldn't be far. Maya crouched in the snow, touching the shallow print. The relief that washed over her was so overwhelming she nearly cried. She followed the line with her eyes until it disappeared behind a stand of fir trees. If the person who left these tracks was familiar with the territory, there might be something, a campsite, a stand, even leftover supplies. She pushed forward, fueled by a burst of adrenaline she couldn't afford to waste. 20 minutes later, she found it, a hunting blind, elevated on wooden stilts, half hidden by the trees, its ladder rungs iced and crooked. The structure wasn't meant to be lived in, but it was intact, off the ground, and strong enough to survive snowfall. A perfect vantage point if search helicopters passed overhead. A potential shelter against the storm building in the west. Her hands trembled as she climbed, gripping the wooden rungs carefully. The last few feet were the hardest. Her ankle screamed in protest, but she pulled herself onto the small platform and pushed open the hatch. Inside was cramped and cold, with a narrow bench and a tiny window facing the valley. But there were also treasures, a metal thermos tucked into a corner, empty but usable, a thin wool blanket left behind by a careless hunter, and tucked behind the bench, a small tin of emergency supplies. Her heart hammered as she opened it. Inside, she found a half-used roll of waterproof matches, an old but working pocket knife, fishing line, and, best of all, a vacuum-sealed pack of jerky. It was stiff and salty and tasted like pure salvation. She ate sparingly, letting each bite sit on her tongue before swallowing. Within minutes, warmth flowed through her body like a slow-moving tide. Her head felt clearer, her hands steadier. A gust of wind rattled the blind. She leaned toward the window and saw the leading edge of the storm sweeping in, thick, dark clouds skimming low over the ridge. She had maybe a few hours before it hit. She knew what she had to do: barricade the blind, insulate it, and wait. She worked through the pain, packing snow into gaps around the hatch to block the draft, laying fir branches on the floor, wrapping herself in the blanket. As the first flakes of the new storm began to fall, she settled onto the bench and closed her eyes. That night, the wind roared so violently it felt like the whole structure trembled. Snow slapped against the wood in waves. She thought often of the cabin collapsing and wondered if she'd made a mistake choosing to shelter here, but the blind held strong. She kept moving her limbs, rubbing her fingers and toes, forcing herself to stay alert. Hours passed in slow, aching increments. On the dawn of the 19th day, she awoke to silence, not just the quiet of snowfall, a mechanical silence. Then, distant, faint, the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades. Her breath caught. She scrambled to the window, flung open the shutter, and stuck her arm out into the freezing air. The chopper was faint, far, maybe even on the other side of the ridge. But it was real. She tore the blanket into 2 strips, long, fluttering ribbons, and tied them to the ends of branches. She waved them in a wide arc, shouting even though she knew they wouldn't hear her voice. Her body shook, each movement sending stabbing pain through her ankle and shoulders, but she didn't stop. Minutes passed. The helicopter began to fade. Her breaths grew ragged, panic threatening to smother her. Then, it dipped, turned, circled back. It had seen something. Maya let out a broken, disbelieving laugh, waving harder than her muscles could handle. The helicopter banked toward her valley, aligning its path directly overhead. Snow blasted outward in a cyclone as it descended. When the rescue team finally reached her, she could barely speak. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and tears streamed hot down her cold cheeks. They wrapped her in insulated blankets, strapped her into a harness, and lifted her into the air. As the white world dropped away beneath her, she glanced once more at the valley, at the narrow path she'd traced through the snow, at the tiny blind that had kept her alive through the storm. 19 days alone, 19 days of fear, hunger, cold, and pain. When the helicopter doors shut and warm air washed over her, Maya closed her eyes, exhaled shakily, and finally let herself believe what she hadn't dared to until that moment. She had survived.